I just think about just Alan. If someone came in through those doors and punched Renee in the face and then walked out, and then the cops go and they capture them, and they bring them before the judge, and the judge looks at the guy and says, "Did you punch her in the face?" He's like, "Yeah." And the judge says to this guy, "But I love you. I really, really love you. So you're free to go." I think that would upset a few folks, would it not? We would expect that person to have to pay for what they've done. We would expect that person to have to pay. Chad, let's just say someone walks in, pushes down April, and takes Trig out that door. And then the cops pull up to them, they catch the guy, bring him to court, and the guy says, "Well, I'm really sorry that I did it. I won't do it again, so can I be forgiven?" And the judge just says, "Oh, yeah, you're fine. Just, you promise not to do it again? Good, go on your way, you're fine." No, that person should have to pay for what they've done. That person needs to be held accountable for their actions. And so, sometimes when we think about God, we want Him to look at our lives, look at our mistakes, and we want Him to just sweep them under the rug and forget about it. Because He's loving, right? God's loving. He'll just forget about it. But the reality is, God is just. The Bible is very clear about that. But before I get to that, I just want to tell you guys what our condition is in. And you guys might have heard this verse before. You probably have. It's Romans 3:23. And it says this: "For everyone has sinned. We all fall short of God's glorious standard." So if you've been in any church at any amount of time, you've heard it. You've heard that passage. If you haven't, it's a very popular passage, but I think there's a couple things about that verse that we need to understand. First of all, it says, "For we all have sinned." And that can be a very encouraging thing for some folks, for everyone. That you're not alone. Because you've disobeyed God, because you have sinned against God, you're not alone. Everyone that's ever walked the face of this earth, except for Jesus Christ, has sinned and fallen short of God's glorious standard. So everyone is deserving of punishment. Just like we would expect someone who does those things that I said, we would expect them to be punished. God is no different. He's a fully just God. And if that judge didn't punish those people, we wouldn't call that judge just. So God is completely just. And we must pay for the things that we've done. On the other hand, I think there's a caution in that verse that we must be careful of. It says, "For everyone has sinned and we all fall short." And I think on the opposite of being encouraged by that, we can be apathetic to this verse. We can hear it so much, we can understand the fact that we're not alone. Everyone else has sinned. So God surely can't punish everyone for sinning, could He? And so there's a tendency, if you hear that, to be apathetic about it. And to not understand that we are under the wrath of God. We are under His judgment. So I want to look really quickly. I don't like usually using a lot of verses, but today I am, and I pray that I don't take anything out of context. I pray that God would keep me from erring as we talk about one of these things. But the first one that I want to look at is in Numbers 14:18. And it says this: "The Lord is slow to anger and filled with unfailing love, forgiving every kind of sin and rebellion, but He does not excuse the guilty. He lays the sins of the parents upon their children. The entire family is affected, even children in the third and fourth generations." And so right here, we see in the middle of there, it says that He does not excuse the guilty. But let me give you a little bit of background information concerning this verse so that I don't take it out of context. This is Moses actually repeating what God said to him. But if you recall, Moses led the people out of Egypt, and he's leading them to the Promised Land. So for 40 years, they're wandering through places. God's doing miracles, rescuing them. And at this point, they're just on the outside of Canaan, the Promised Land. They're ready to go in. And so God tells Moses, "Hey, you get 12 spies, one from each tribe, and send them into Canaan to see if we can overtake them." Or not to see if we can overtake them. He actually lists a bunch of stuff, and none of them is if we can win. It's just gather, what kind of food do they have there? How strong is their army? So they're basically doing a recon mission. So he sends those 12 spies in to Canaan. They go, they come back with like huge grapes that 2 people have to carry. They come back with all this awesome fruit. And so like this land is the place to live. This is the land that God's promised them. So as they come back, 10 of the spies realize that there's giants living in this land. They're like, there's no way we can overtake these guys. But Caleb comes back and he says, let's go fight him now. God said we can win this battle. We're going to win this battle. Let's go. But the other 10 are just like, no, we shouldn't fight them. They're going to overtake us. They're going to crush us. They even say they're like grasshoppers. We're like grasshoppers to these guys. And so Joshua and Caleb actually are ready to go in. They say they try to encourage people, say, hey, God says we can have this land. We can overtake them. But the people kind of overrule them and they say, no, we're not going to do it. And so God gets angry with them. God even gets to the point where I want to disown these people. I don't want to be their God anymore. And so Moses is pleading with God for forgiveness, as you see in that verse. And that's the context of what Moses says this. And so Moses says, and you can pull the screen back up. He says, but he does not excuse the guilty. Talking of God. God does not excuse the guilty. So what that means for us is that if you sin against God, he does not excuse it so easily. There's a price and a penalty that must be paid for sinning against God. I also want to look at Romans 1:18 through 20. It's kind of small, but if you read it along with me, it just says, but God shows his anger from heaven against all sinful, wicked people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. They know the truth about God because he has made it obvious to them. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power, and divine nature. So they have no excuse for not knowing God. It says that God shows his anger from heaven against all who are wicked and suppress the truth. So God, believe it or not, gets angry with those who sin. And I think that's something that we should expect of God. When someone does evil against another person, if God didn't get angry, like I said before, if he just showed love, he'd be a weak God that let people just run over him and do whatever they wanted and love them anyway. No, God gets angry when you suppress his truth. God gets angry when you live a wicked life. And so there is a penalty that must be paid for that. And it's kind of cool in that verse too. It talks about that there's no excuse. If you've never opened a Bible, if you've never been to a church, it says you can know that God's power by what he's made, by what he's created. So there will never be a day when you stand before God and it's a valid defense to say, I didn't know. I didn't know what I was doing was wrong. I didn't know that you were a powerful God. Because what he's made, what he's created, tells us of his power. Tells us of his glory. So there's no one that will ever be standing before God with a valid excuse. So, another thing that I think about wrath, I want to look at Romans 2:5 really quickly. And it says this, but because you are stubborn and refuse to turn from your sin, you are storing up terrible punishment for yourself. For a day of anger is coming when God's righteous judgment will be revealed. I think a lot of times, too, when people think about God and think of him as a soft, loving God, I think sometimes they can mistake the fact that when you disobey God, when you sin against God, the sky doesn't crack open, and he doesn't strike you dead right there, that he's weak, that he's ignoring your sin, that he's forgetting about it.